opinion really already got it right. Of course, there are influences, but it's not 100% what the Hebrew Bible is made of. And I think nowadays we really can look at the ancient Near Eastern traditions in a very relaxed way and see how they were being taken up by the Hebrew Bible and how they were interpreted, repurposed, transformed, and so on. So the basic observation of our project is the following. With a grain of salt, one can say that the ancient Near Eastern law collections usually identify the king as the lawgiver. In later times, we also have this very specific notion or this specific expression that the king is the lex animata or the nomos empsychos, and this is very easy to understand because the king is the central figure in ancient Near Eastern society. So he is the ultimate person, if there are laws to be given, to serve in this capacity as a lawgiver. If we look at the Torah, at least somehow how it is presented today to its readers, but also to ancient readers, of course, then we have a different outlook. The law is presented as God's law. And this, of course, raises the question, what happened here? So between the older ancient Near Eastern law collections and the Torah, the ancient Near Eastern laws that are being shaped as king's laws and the biblical law that is us.
It's really disturbing.
And let's have a quick look into these laws in the ancient Near East. So in the Codex Hammurabi, of course, the law is not detached from the sphere of the divine, but the deities are not immediately identified as lawgivers. Here is one sentence from the epilogue to the Codex Hammurabi. I, Hammurabi, am a righteous king. To me, Shamash has granted truth. And I think one can also exemplify this in the iconography of this image on top of this stela. Here, Shamash hands something over to Hammurabi, who is standing here on the left-hand side. And in earlier research, sometimes scholars even thought that here Shamash is handing over something like a pencil or a pen, which of course would somehow point to the possibility that Shamash is dictating these laws. But it seems like this is a mistaken interpretation. It's a staff, it's a rod and a ring. And these two elements, they denote the authority that is being transferred to the king Hammurabi, who then conceives of his own or builds up his own laws. There is a quite nice summary by the already quite classical Assyriologist Jacob Finkelstein, who wrote, "What the gods give the king is not laws, but the gift of perception of Titum, by virtue of which the king, in distinction from any other individual, becomes capable of promulgating laws that are in accord or harmony with the cosmic principle of Titum." And you have quite a similar idea and notion in the in this inscription of Yachtum Ling of the king of Mari. This is a foundation stone to the Shamash temple in Mari. Here we can read, "To Shamash, whose allotted portion is righteousness, to whom truth hath been granted as gift. So we can see that even Shamash himself, he guarantees the sphere of justice and righteousness, but he is not the creator of justice and righteousness. Justice and righteousness is something that is even of supra-divine origin. If we look at the Hebrew Bible, on the other hand, I think there it's conspicuous that the very first thing that God says to the humans that he created is something which is a law. Be fruitful and multiply and fill and the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the several creatures. So this already highlights how important this idea of God as a lawgiver is in the Hebrew Bible. And then, of course, in the Torah, we have a large text portion that begins in the middle of the book of Exodus and reaches until the book of Numbers, this whole Sinai pericope, which is denotes and describes this process of law giving. So again, what happened here? When, how, and why? Why is the Torah, in a quite surprising way in its ancient Near Eastern context, not shaped as royal law? Why is it shaped as divine law? And I will try to discuss this question by taking a closer look here at the covenant code in Exodus 20 to 23. And if we look at these biblical texts in a historical perspective, it's absolutely crucial to make one fundamental distinction. This is the distinction between the world of the narrative and the world of the narrator. What I mean by this, I will quickly exemplify by a non-biblical example. So if we read Friedrich Schiller's Wilhelm Tell, the world of the narrative is, of course, Switzerland in the 13th century CE, and the world of the narrator, this is the world of Friedrich Schiller. And it doesn't come as a surprise if I tell you, if you read Friedrich Schiller's Wilhelm Tell, you will learn much more about 19th century Germany in historical perspective than on 13th century Switzerland. So you can, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, you can also picture it this way. So the world of the narrative spans from the creation to the Persian period, whereas the world of the narrator or the narrators in the Hebrew Bible, it starts somewhere around the 9th, 8th century for the written texts, and it extends into the Hellenistic period. Probably the latest texts also in the Pentateuch belong to the 4th century. Some very late editions might even belong to the 2nd century. So, and if we now look at the Sinai pericope in Exodus through Numbers, we have to be aware that, of course, these texts are historically shaped by the according world of the narrator. These are the three main law collections within the Torah, the so-called covenant code, the Deuteronomic code at the very end in Deuteronomy, and the holiness legislation as they have it here in Jerusalem. And you also see the alleged dates of these three collections, which reflect more or less of a scholarly consensus. And we will now be looking more closely here at the covenant code in Exodus 20 to 23. The literary growth of the covenant code. The covenant code is not a text that was written in one specific period, but it grew over time. If we simplify for a moment the structure of the covenant code, then we can say there is a literary kernel in Exodus 21 to 22, say, and this core resembles very much the ancient Near Eastern legal texts as we have it in the big and great ancient Near Eastern law codes, whereas we have two frameworks or two framework elements, and they also, cum grano salis, they provide the outlook of the overall composition as divine laws. Here in these texts, here in the former part of the framework, and these texts there in the latter part of the framework, they, if you wish, and this is of course now already a diachronic hypothesis, they reinterpret these laws here that all are being written or shaped in the third person. They reinterpret the whole thing as a divine law. So let's have a quick look at this. So there is a very famous passage within the Covenant Code, the goring ox, and Bernard Jackson, a legal scholar of ancient studies, once said the goring ox is probably the most prominent animal in legal history because it shows up in different law codes. So we also have it in the Bible. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox is innocent. But if the ox gored in the past and its owner has been warned but has not restrained it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned and its owner shall also be put to death. You see, this is all written and formulated in the third person. No divine element in it. And the interesting thing is that this legal regulation in the center of the Covenant Code resembles very much what we know from the ancient Near Eastern law codes. And in the Codex Hammurabi, we indeed have a very, very similar regulation. If an ox gores a man and it is known that it is a gore, and the owner, does not protect its horn or does not tie the ox up, and the ox gores a man and kills him, the owner shall pay 1/2 a mina in silver. So you see, this is very, very close to what we have in the Covenant Code, although there are some differences. So first of all, in the Covenant Code, you have this differentiation. If a man or a woman is the victim of this goring ox, this is already a certain extension. And then we have a somewhat atavistic element. The ox shall be stoned and its flesh shall not be eaten. This is nothing that we know of in the Codex Hammurabi. What happens to the ox apparently is not of interest here. And then finally, here we have this third element that is a difference. The ox shall be stoned and its owner should also be put to death in the case that the owner had been warned. And here also you see the difference to the Codex Hammurabi is, here in this second case, if the owner had been warned, he has to pay something, but the Bible is stricter, and here the owner shall be put to death. And I think this is a good element that shows that legal history does not always develop into more humane notions and ideas. One has to be cautious here. But for our purpose, it's very important to maintain that the core of the covenant covenant code basically resembles what we know from the ancient Near Eastern law codes, or as Raymond Westbrook put it, the core of the covenant code can be characterized as a provincial reflection of the cuneiform legal tradition. And since 2010, we also have these tablets or these fragments from Hatzor that really show and prove that there was an exchange of material, of traditions in the legal sphere between Mesopotamia and ancient Israel. So this is what we can see in the earliest parts of the covenant code. Now let's have a quick look at the framework parts. The framework parts, and here I first will deal with the front part of the framework part. This framework consists of nothing less than 4 elements that, like an onion, surround the core of the covenant code. And I will go back from the allegedly oldest framework part to the younger elements that then follow. And this may come maybe a little bit as a surprise. Exodus 21, 2 to 11, this is the first law, the first legal regulation within the covenant code. And I subsume this already in a certain respect among the framework elements. I will explain that in a second, and then I will turn to the other elements that have been placed apparently in front of the older framework parts. So the main observation why the manumission of the slave laws in Exodus 21, 2 to 11, at least in some capacity, fulfills framework function is this conspicuous formulation in the second person, ki tikne evet ivri. If you buy a Hebrew slave, this is remarkable because all of the rest of this law is fully formulated in the third person. So the second person really stands out. And apparently here, somehow God is speaking to Israel. So it's not an explicit mention of God. God somehow tells Moses what he has to tell Israel. But we can see here is a very remarkable and outstanding element at the very beginning of the covenant code. And the second observation can be added. This manumission law of slaves is placed so prominently at the very beginning of the covenant code, so that one has to ask why. The much more fundamental laws about capital crimes, they follow then in Exodus 21:12, but the manumission of slaves apparently has been considered to be more important. And I think the answer is quite easy to give, why this manumission law is so central in Exodus 21 to 23. This has to do with the integration of the covenant code, which probably was at some point in history textual body unto itself, has to do with the integration of this body within the narrative framework of the Pentateuch. So this formulation, if you buy a slave, this only makes sense if we have this narrative setting of God giving his laws to Moses and Israel. And of course, the manumission of slaves resonates with Israel's own destiny, which is also freed from the slavery in Egypt. Let's have a look at the second element, or the second oldest element in the framework of the covenant code. This is Exodus 21:1. These are the ordinances that you shall set before them. And it's just the communication structure of that very sentence that shows that a lot is presupposed here. All these ordinances that you shall set before them. Who is speaking to whom here? That's also quite clear from the narrative setting. The speaker is God, you is Moses, and them is Israel. But here we can clearly see Exodus 21:1. This is an element that presupposes already the integration of the covenant code within the narrative thread of the Pentateuch. And of course, this interprets these older legal regulations, which are formulated in the third person, now as something that has its origin in God himself. Exodus 20:24 to 26 is the next element. This is this famous altar law, an altar of earth you shall make for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen, at any place where I cause my name to be remembered. I will come to you and bless you. And the I is here, of course, the divine I, the I of God himself. So again, this is a legal regulation which is from the very beginning shaped as a divine law. And for our historical question about the historical origin of this idea, this text is particularly interesting because it's taken up in Deuteronomy 12. And Deuteronomy 12 is a text that we can date. It belongs to the end of the 7th century. It reflects in some capacity probably the cult centralization that is ascribed to King Josiah in the Bible in 2 Kings 23. Here we have a clear literary relationship to the other text. Take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place that you see, but at the place that Adonai will choose in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I'm commanding you. You see the difference here. At any place, sacrifices can be brought, and here the cult is being centralized to one specific place, and it is to assume that this text has Jerusalem in mind, but because of the Mosaic fiction, Jerusalem cannot be named explicitly. So if we can date Deuteronomy 12 to the late 7th century, this means that this element, Exodus 20, 24 to 26, the altar law, needs to be something that is older than the late 7th century. And this gives us already a hint in which time period this process of the theologization of the legal texts in the covenant code might belong to. And finally, the first element, this is also something that we can date quite confidently to the exilic or the post-exilic period, because here we have this saying, this text, and Adonai said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, you have seen for yourselves how I spoke with you from heaven. From heaven, you shall not make gods of silver alongside me, nor shall you make yourselves gods of gold. And this idea or the notion of Adonai being the God of heaven, we know this particularly from texts of the Second Temple period. It's also attested in Elephantine. So if we sum this up, we can see, so this very first element of the framework reflects already the integration of the covenant code into the Exodus narrative. The altar law is earlier than Deuteronomy 12, so must be somewhere in the middle of the 7th century, and Exodus 20 seems to belong to the Persian period if we compare this idea of the God of heaven with related text elsewhere. A bit quicker, let's have a look at the rear part of the framework in Exodus 22, 17 to 26. There is more framework material, but I'm focusing here just on this part here. There are other parts that are also shaped as divine laws, but this is the most interesting text, because here we can see that this theologization of the covenant code is inspired by prophetic and also texts, but also by the tradition of the Psalms. So here is one element that is, I think, quite interesting. So in this rear part of the framework, the theological framework of the covenant code, we have this regulation. If you take your neighbor's coats in pledge, you shall restore it before the sun goes down. And if your neighbor cries out to me, I, God, will listen, for I am compassionate. And there is one text in the Hebrew Bible that is very close to this regulation in Exodus 22, and this is this element here in the book of Amos. Thus says Adonai, For the transgression of Israel, I will not revoke the punishment, because they lay themselves down besides every altar on coats taken in pledge. So let's for a moment assume that Exodus 22 is taking up Amos 2. What is happening here? Here you have an element of prophetic social criticism, and here you have a law, a legal regulation. And apparently this legal regulation, written by the authors of the framework of the Covenant Code, they took up this prophetic criticism from Amos and transformed this idea from a prophetic criticism into, if you wish, positive law. And this is, of course, also of significance for the genesis, for the intellectual historical genesis of this idea of divine laws. So this link back to the prophets from Exodus 22, this might be one of the elements that served as legitimation to shape these otherwise impersonal laws now as divine laws. And we have here a second element that is important. So, and if your neighbor of whom you might take away his coat, if he cries out to me in such a case, I, God, will listen, for I am compassionate. And this expression, Ki Hanun Ani, this is something that we know very well from the tradition of Psalms. And here again, we have actually a similar movement or a similar relation. This this rear framework of the Covenant Code is not only inspired by prophetic social criticism, it's also inspired by the Jerusalemite temple theology, as it is attested in the tradition of the Psalms, because we are here, we really also have, in a very prominent way, this expression of El Hanun. And I just somehow, out of this selection here of instances, I just printed out Psalm 86, 15. So let me sum up, or also elaborate a little bit on what we have discussed so far, forces and factors that shaped the Covenant Code in as divine law. And here I would like first to make a methodological consideration. This is Thorkild Jacobsen, a famous Assyriologist of Scandinavian origin, and he wrote a very successful book targeted towards a broader auditory, The Treasures of Darkness. And in this book, he presented as a methodological principle to understand religious ideas in the ancient Near East as politicomorphism. What does he mean by politicomorphism? The idea is that every religion is shaped according to the political and social structures that its adherents know, and they extrapolate their social and political convictions into the heavenly realm. And this is something that also took place in the religious history of ancient Israel. And if we now ask about the different forces and factors that shaped the laws in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, and particularly in the Covenant Code as divine laws, then a variety of factors come into play. And I do not claim to be exhaustive here, and some of them are also more distant and less direct than other ones, but and some are just paving the ground for that process. But here are my considerations. So first, I would say when Israel and Judah became states, and this is something that probably belonged to the 9th and 8th century BCE, these states were being shaped as monarchies, and this has an effect on how God is being thought of. If a society that is organized as a monarchy thinks of its heavenly realm, then it's clear that also their gods need to be a king. And probably in the 9th, 8th century, God really ascended to kingship, and at the same time, this is also a process that might be closely related to somehow the coming of this God to Jerusalem. We know that the biblical God has its origins somewhere here in the south. We know this from inscriptions, but also from ancient texts like Judges 5 or Psalm 68. This solarization took place because Jerusalem is closely associated with the solar tradition, particularly the pre-Avistic Jerusalem. So the Temple of Solomon, for example, is oriented west-east, which is not very normal among the temples in the southern or northern Levant. And we also have explicit characterizations of the biblical God as Shemesh. This is something which apparently took place when the traders of this Adonai religion came to Jerusalem. So this might have been one very general factor that, set the ground or set the stage for this development of divine laws. A second element is the traditional distance of the jurisdiction in Israel and Judah from the royal court. Here you see one of these 6 chamber gates that we have in Chatzor, in Megiddo, or in Gezer. And we know from the biblical text that within these chambers, several things took place, among them jurisdiction of the elders that lived in such a place. And if the juridic system is not so closely associated with the royal court, this of course helps at some point to detaching the legislation from the royal realm to the divine. And then we have the reception of prophetic social criticism that I think was a much more concrete factor. I exemplified this with the reception of Amos 2 in Exodus 22, but also besides the prophetic tradition, also the Psalm tradition played a role here. And then maybe one of the most important elements was the subversive reception of the Neo-Assyrian imperial ideology in the 7th century. So the Assyrians, they created the first worldwide empire in ancient, not only in ancient Near Eastern history, but somehow in the part of the world that was being perceived as global in that corner of the world. So the Assyrian ruled with a lot of violence over the subdued kings and people. So here you can see in this statue the Assyrian great king and the representatives of the subdued people, and you can see that there are leashes that are leading down here to the noses of these subdued kings, and also the difference in size, of course, somehow says the Assyrian great king is everything, and the subdued kings, they are nothing. And since the findings in Tel Kainat 2012, we also know that Assyrian vassal treaties were known not only in the east, but also in the west of the empire. So the Assyrians not only used brutal force to dominate their subdued vassals, but they also introduced a legal tradition of vassal treaties, and these vassal treaties, they asked complete loyalty of these subdued kings towards the Assyrian great king. And it's quite a well-known or old or well-established tradition in Hebrew Bible scholarship since the 60s, since Frankena, Dion, and then Weinfold, and in more recent times, Otto and Levinson, that the Hebrew Bible actually took up this template of these Neo-Assyrian vassal treaties that asked the subdued kings or principes to be completely loyal to the Assyrian great king, that the Hebrew Bible took that up in the book of Deuteronomy. I would add also in the Exodus story, and produced something like a subversive reception of it. At some point in the late 7th century, these priests, these scribes, somehow they maintained that the Israelites don't have to be completely loyal to the Neo-Assyrian great king, but to their own God. And all these scholars here, they applied this idea of subversive reception basically to the book of Deuteronomy, because it has the same structure like the Assyrian vassal treaties. But I think one can also say that the integration of the covenant code within the Exodus story serves the same purpose, because the Exodus story actually really tells this story of the liberation of the people of Israel from Egyptian dominion to the liberation and now to the dominion under God. God now serves the function that otherwise the Neo-Assyrian great king has. And there is quite an old book by Georges Ozu from 1964, which captures this movement already in its title, De la servitude au service. So the servitude, la servitude, this is something which characterizes Israel under Egypt, and the service, this is Israel under God. So apparently this subversive reception of the Neo-Assyrian vassal treaties, this was something that probably was, again, a more specific element that led to this idea of divine laws. And then I think finally, one of the elements that then sealed this process was the loss of kingdom and stateship. I think one can name or identify here the two downfalls, both of Israel in the north, 722, and Judah in the south, 587 BCE. Once the royal jurisdiction is lost, then there is basically no other option than to look out for divine legislation. And this also brings with it that once these laws are now being shaped as divine laws, and you don't have an executive law enforcement system, then you have to appeal, or these scribes of the Hebrew Bible, they have to appeal to the human insight, to the evidence of these regulations. So here, again, with our example of the codes that are being taken in pledge. So here you have several rationales that are being given. For it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as a cover. In what else shall that person sleep? So these texts are appealing to the insight of those who are reading them. So here you have again these 5 forces and factors, and I simply show them again in a row to highlight. Of course, this is not a targeted process. There is no such thing as targeted processes in history or in intellectual history, and this list is far from being exhaustive, but it tries somehow to identify some of the main factors that led to this shaping of the Torah as divine law in its ancient Near Eastern context. There may be others, and they may be of various or of different significances and of different weight, but they are maybe an approach to understand why these laws in the Hebrew Bible are shaped as divine. Thank you for your attention.